All right, so as we return to our series regarding heroes of the church, we come across a man who was actually born in a castle. It's kind of starts off as a fairy tale. His name was Thomas Aquinas. Now, he was born in the year 1225 in Italy near a city named Aquino. That's where he gets his last name. So technically, it's actually not his last name. It's that he was born near Aquino. His father was a knight under the Emperor Frederick II. And so what his family desired was Thomas's uncle was an abbot at Monte Cassino. An abbot is essentially a leader over a monastery, okay? And we don't have much time to get into the different orders of monasteries, but Monte Cassino was one of the oldest Benedictine monasteries in extent at that time. Okay, now as Thomas was getting older, his father was seeking for baronage for Thomas, to which Thomas refused, and he actually lived all of his life near the edge of poverty. And we'll get to some of the reasons why. However, first, many men and women seek to get certain educational academic degrees, to where they'll have these initials at the end of their name, MD or DD, PhD, sometimes Esquire, ESQ for lawyers and so forth. Thomas Aquinas is the only one in all of history who has DA at the end of his name, which stands for, as we've mentioned, Doctor Angelicus, the Doctor of the Angels, which was given him by the church. His doctorate, his mastery of theology essentially gave him the title Doctor Angelicus, the Doctor of the Angels. And another fascinating thing, I think, regarding Thomas is he's referred to as Saint Thomas Aquinas. Sometimes he's just referred to as Thomas Aquinas. But in theological circles and in Christian circles specifically and in general, he's referred to as simply Thomas, just Thomas, which is fascinating. Think about all the millions of Thomases that have existed and still continue to exist. But whenever anybody refers to, especially again in theological circles, as to Thomas, everybody knows to whom that name refers. In fact, his theology, his study of theology, we've discussed Augustinianism, and Lutheranism or Calvinism. You have these names for these theologians, where Thomas's is known as Thomism. It's not Aquinasism, it's Thomism. So, this man was singularly special. Very, very briefly, Thomas Aquinas had one of those intellects that come every 500 years, every 1,000 years. We think of men like Albert Einstein or Isaac Newton. Thomas Aquinas was certainly one of these great thinkers. I've been asked, who are my five favorite theologians? And, that's quite easy for me. It would be Augustine, Thomas, Luther, Calvin, and Edwards. Now, Augustine, I find fascinating and brilliant for his pioneering work. He was really the first one to start developing Christian doctrines, and specifically more theological doctrines for the church. Martin Luther is more famous for his appreciation and his focus on certain vignettes of theology. Calvin probably had a better systematic theology as it relates to the Bible than most likely anybody in church history. However, if you were to ask me who among these, just out of sheer intellectual aptitude, who rises above these, I'd actually have to say, because I think that's an unfair question anyway. Everybody was dealing with their own situations and for their own purposes, for the purposes of God. And I'd have to say the top two are actually tied with Thomas Aquinas and Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, who we will discuss later in this series, I find to be the most brilliant mind in all of American history, absolutely. But I think Jonathan Edwards and he had profound and prolific minds. Okay, now to return to the life of Aquinas. Now, very briefly, I do want to say at the outset, with Thomas, Protestants have a tendency to suggest that Protestants are disciples of Augustine, and Catholics are disciples of Thomas Aquinas. And so we're actually going to have two sessions regarding Thomas. Today, I want to discuss his life. Then next week, I want to discuss some of his contributions to the church, where actually did come down into Protestantism as well. In particular, his natural theology, but we'll see some biblical theology as well that has passed down to the Protestant circles as well. So this is going to be the first of two lectures, whatever you want to call these, regarding St. Thomas. Okay, now, when he was 5 years old, he was already, everybody observed, he already had a prolific mind. He had profound questions. In fact, when we're young, we ask very penetrating questions, sometimes to the annoyance of our parents. However, one of his most profound questions, I think anyway, when he was young, is not who is God and who made God and so forth, but what is God? And we will explore that, God willing, next week. However, at the age of 5, he was sent to Monte Cassino to begin learning, to be raised up into the abbacy. Again, that's what his family wanted for him, to basically take over for his uncle Sinibald in the monastery of Monte Cassino. While he was there, at the age of 14, Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX had an issue with each other. And so this controversy, this conflict spilled over into the Abbey of Monte Cassino. And so his family sent St. Thomas to Naples, where the school in Naples is likely really where he came across Augustine and Averroes. Averroes is a Muslim theologian we will discuss next week, God willing. However, in particular, Aristotle. Aristotle very much influenced Thomas's thinking, in particular his natural theology, which we discussed in our series regarding apologetics, but we will return to next week, God willing. However, so in Naples, he became more influenced by Aristotle, the teaching of Aristotle. After some time, he found a scholar of the Dominican order. It's a different monastic order. And again, without getting into too much detail, the Dominican order at this time was somewhat newer, but it was a much more ascetic life, not to depart into the desert and so forth, but you would live in abject poverty and ultimately give all your goods to the poor and seek to merely study the Bible, to know the things of God and to teach the things of God. And he became very influenced by this Dominican order. At the age of 19, he decided he wanted to be a part of this Dominican order, to which, like many families do, his family absolutely objected to this. They didn't mind if he became a monk at the Benedictine monastery, because this would be typical for noble families. In other words, he would still be rich, he would still be affluent and so forth. In the Benedictine monastery, in the Dominican monastery, he would be poor, and his family didn't want this. They kind of saw it as an embarrassment. So the Dominican order, in order to kind of keep his family's influence from doing anything about this, they were sending him off to Paris. They were going to send him to Rome first and then to Paris. On his journey, his brothers actually kidnapped him and brought him to the castle, where he was imprisoned for a year. In the castle for a year. And while he was imprisoned, he still followed the Dominican order. In other words, at the given time, whatever you were supposed to do on a Tuesday at noon, so to speak, he would do on Tuesday at noon. And he would start memorizing the scriptures. He began to memorize the scriptures. And he would tutor his sisters. Okay, so during this time, this imprisonment is not dissuading Thomas from the Dominican order. I mean, this is the purpose for which he is being imprisoned. They were trying to change his mind from becoming under the Dominican order. Now, after some time, his brothers got frustrated and they ended up hiring a prostitute who went into Thomas's cell. And tradition says that he chased her off with a burning log and then, drew a cross in the wall. Now, after he chased her out, 2 angels visited him. This is what part of his canonization. Very briefly, in the Catholic Church, we see that they canonize these saints, special men and women who've devoted their lives and committed their lives over to the things of God. And so, in Thomas's canonization, which happened less than 100 years after his birth, and we'll discuss that after some time. However, in his canonization, it said this is one of the testimonies for his sainthood. Okay, that these 2 angels visited him, and it's essentially gave him the grace of chastity from Christ himself, to where he remained a virgin throughout his life. And again, we've discussed chastity and how much this was emphasized in early Christianity and the Middle Ages and so forth. And Thomas Aquinas had great fidelity in his chastity. Now, finally, when his family realized that Thomas isn't going to acquiesce to their commands, and he is committed to the Dominican order and committed to serving God under this ascetic lifestyle, his mother, really to save face, which I'll get to here in a second, but his mother led him to escape out a window. If we remember the 2 spies of Jericho, we remember Paul out of the window of Jerusalem. His mother helped drop him out of the window. Now, this was to save embarrassment. In other words, it would behoove the family more if there was this secret escape, rather than that the family just conceded and let Thomas go into the Dominican order. So this was kind of a political deal, the political situation, to where she allowed him to escape. Now, once he escaped, he ended up in Paris. Okay, now at the University of Paris, he came under Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great. Okay, now, not many of us have heard of Albert the Great, but this man was a brilliant man. And likely, if there never would have been a Thomas Aquinas, there would have been Albert the Great. We would have known his name more. In fact, Albert the Great knew of the intellectual capacity that Thomas had. In fact, because of how Thomas looked, we're told that he was a big fella. He had huge feet. He had an unusually big head. One eye was slightly more squinted than the other. He was a rather oofish looking fellow. And he was quiet. And so his classmates would call him the dumb ox of Aquino. And when this was finally heard by Albert the Great, he turned and he said, he might be a dumb ox of Aquino, but this dumb ox is going to turn the world upside down. He knew that. He knew that. Now, so with Augustine's being teased and so forth, people did recognize his chastity and his charity. He was always giving time and money and goods to the poor. He was always gracious to people, very kind. He manifested the fruits of the Spirit that we see in the Bible, a wonderful Christian man. However, again, he would continually be teased. And there's this one anecdotal story of while he was in class and they're all studying, right? One of the classmates, one of the boys, went to the window and he turned around and he told Thomas, Thomas, there's a cow flying. There's a flying cow out here. To which Thomas got up all excited, ran to the window and looked out. And as soon as he looked out, everybody started laughing. Everybody started laughing at his naivete that he might believe that there's actually a cow flying. To which he turned around and said, I'd rather believe that cows can fly than my brothers can lie to me, or would lie to me. And that was the end of the laughter. Thomas was a humble man, very humble. Now, after some time, in fact, Albert the Great assigned him as master student. Thomas didn't really want this privilege, but he became the master student. Now, after he got his degree, he began to get his master's, in divinity. And he began one of his two great summas. He wrote many different things throughout his life, which we will consider. But two of his greatest works are his two summas. The Summa Contra Gentiles, so the summary against the Gentiles, and the Summa Theologia, or Summa Theologica, which is a theological summary, in other words. Great volumes, wonderful volumes. In fact, so he did end up finishing the Summa Contra Gentiles after some time. And then he took up writing the Summa Theologia. And one of another mystical experiences he had toward the end of his life, because again, he was a great teacher. Let me take a little bit of a side trail here. So like Augustine before him, and like Luther who would come after him, and Calvin who would come after him, and Edwards who would come after him, not only was he a prolific theologian and had a prolific mind, but he was a magnificent preacher. It's said that he would have to pause at times during his sermons to compose himself from his tears, and he would actually have to pause for a bit longer for the congregation to regain their composure as well. He was a prolific preacher, and he wrote many things, he preached many things, he taught many things. One of the things toward the end of his life, we're not given specific details, but he had an experience while he was attending church, celebrating the Mass. This was slightly after Easter, and while he was celebrating the Mass, something came over him. Something came over him, and he declined to write any more for the rest of his life. He retired his pen. Now his assistant at the time compelled him. He begged him to continue working, to continue his work, in particular the Summa Theologia. I mean, is this great work ultimately to be left undone? So he would beg Thomas, and Thomas says, Reginald, that was his name, I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me. He had many experiences. When he was writing his commentary, he wrote many different commentaries, in particular the commentary on Isaiah, commentary on Jeremiah, commentary on Ecclesiastes. But while he was writing his commentary on Isaiah, he was getting stuck. The theologian, the pastor, the minister prays over his study and so forth, will seek different commentaries, will seek the Greek and the Hebrew language and so forth. But sometimes we're not able to penetrate, or those are not able to penetrate the depths of the scriptures as well as we'd like. And this was frustrating to him, and he was praying fervently for insight. Now, Reginald, his assistant, was around at that time, and he overheard Thomas Aquinas having a conversation with at least one other man. And after this conversation ended, after this conversation was concluded, Thomas had Reginald come and he started dictating commentary for Isaiah, and then he was sending Reginald off to sleep. And Reginald fell on his knees and said, "I will not go." Essentially, I am not going to leave here until you tell me the man or the men to whom you spoke. And Thomas Aquinas was very reluctant until finally he relented, and he told Reginald, though, "Do not tell anyone of this while I'm alive. Do not tell it," as much like Jesus and many other things he said. "Tell no one of this until after my glorification." What happened, what he told Reginald, was that he was visited by the apostles Paul and Peter, and they instructed him on the commentary to Isaiah. Now, this is whether, or not he was actually visited by Peter and Paul. I mean, it's not all that customary to be visited, by the apostles Peter and John at night, or at any time for that matter. So this is one of the deals, right, for Protestants who balk at such an idea. However, if there's anybody in church history to whom the apostles Peter and Paul would appear, it's Thomas Aquinas. So whether or not this actually took place, he was able to finish his commentary on Isaiah. And again, I'm of the belief that if anybody in all the church history would have been visited by these two amazing apostles, it was Thomas Aquinas. So this is also another testimony that was added into his canonization for sainthood. Now, after his experience at that Mass, when he retired his pen, he was 48 years old at the time. 48 years old, and retired his pen forever. And the Pope at that time he sought a council with the Eastern Orthodox Church. This was after the Great Schism, okay? And so he wanted to bring unity back between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And after this council, what the Pope wanted to do was to issue Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles. So he wanted Thomas to come, okay? While Thomas was on his way, he was riding a donkey and he hit his head on a fallen tree and became severely ill. And the monks took care of him to an extent to where he regained his strength and returned on the journey. On his return, he became even more severely ill until finally he died. At his death, just before he died, he said, "I have written and taught much about this very holy body, and about the other sacraments in the faith of Christ, and about the Holy Roman Church, to whose correction I expose and submit everything I have written." He's praying to Christ here. He's praying to God, and he's thanking God for the church and also his influence into the church. However, he had also said at one point, "God, I have never spoken ill of you. I have never defamed you. I have never cursed you. However, if I've gotten anything wrong, that is due to my ignorance, and I do not, I stand corrected if this is the case." And this is where he says, "To whose the Holy Roman Church, to whose correction I expose and submit everything I have written." He died on March 7th, 1274, while giving his commentary on the Song of Songs. Thomas Aquinas died at the age of 49. When I think of all of what he composed and his influence on the church, it's in such a short time span. 49, I'm 44 years old. I haven't written anything, I'm 44 years old, 5 years from now. And this man did more to influence the church than possibly anybody else in church history. Died at 49 years old. And it wasn't long after, again, about 98 years after his birth, he was canonized as a saint. And the Pope at that time said, out of all the doctors who have influenced the church, none have influenced the church as much as Thomas. And I think that's right. I think that's right. Again, for all that I love about Augustine, and all that I love about Luther, and all that I love about Calvin, and all that I love about Edwards, and other men besides, and women besides, there's nobody like Thomas. There's nobody like Thomas Aquinas, who, again, not only had a prolific mind, but had a prolific heart. He would pray fervently while he was studying for his sermons, while he was studying for his commentaries. He would pray fervently in tears. He was deathly afraid of misleading or misguiding the church. Out of his own folly, he was deathly afraid of this. And I think that is reflective of a faithful man of God. Anyone who would stand before a lectern or a pulpit to teach or to preach the things of God must have this humble spirit, must be fervently praying for his own understanding, for the grace of wisdom by God, and also for his congregation, or for his disciples, or for his classroom, for his people. But he would tearfully pray for insight and understanding. A man, in my opinion, nobody compares to the intellectual capacity, the poignancy of Thomas Aquinas in at least the last 1,000 years. Nobody compares to Thomas Aquinas. I would implore any of you to read Thomas Aquinas. Now, it can be very difficult. Okay, it's not always easy. He's profound. And sometimes you need to know some of the philosophical terms to kind of understand these things. So I'd be happy to help you along with that. I've actually assigned our youngest boy over his summer vacation to read Summa Contra Gentiles. It's more of an apologetic book, which again, God willing, we will get to next week, because I feel compelled that, again, with this view of Thomas Aquinas, in particular in Protestant circles, to have a whole message regarding what he's given to the church. But Thomas Aquinas, who lived for 49 years, heavily influenced the Middle Ages of the church and still influences the church today. As we mentioned, and we will get to very briefly next week, God willing, but Immanuel Kant essentially is one who is assumed to have decimated the classical synthesis, which came largely anyway from Thomas Aquinas. And we will see that did not happen. It was assumed that it happened, but it never did take place. In fact, I think to answer Kant, we should just go back to what Aquinas had said in the first place. However, we will look at that in our next session regarding Thomas Aquinas. All right, praise God, and let's pray.